Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Autumn Hamry. I'm the Field Marketing Manager here at Hyperproof, and I'll be getting us started. Today, our experts will be discussing the top findings from our fifth annual benchmark survey. Each year, we ask over 1,000 GRC professionals about their pain points, IT risk and compliance budgets, staffing, risk management best practices, and more to compare results from the previous year, provide an in-depth view of the market's current state, and prepare for this year and into the future. A bit of housekeeping points before we get started with the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we welcome you to enter them into the Q&A box for our survey author to answer in real time. Any questions we don't get to, we'll follow up after the webinar. If you're having any problems with audio or visual during the event, please try leaving the presentation and re-entering. If this doesn't work, please let us know you're having trouble in the Q&A box. The event is being recorded and will be made available on demand on our Bright Talk channel following closing of the event. And lastly, attendees will receive an email with a link to the on-demand event as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kane McGladrey, Hyperproof's Field CISO, and Aidan Collins, Director of Enterprise Markets at Hyperproof. Take it away, team.
Thanks, Autumn, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. We're excited to have this time with you. My name is Aidan Collins. I'm with Hyperproof. My role here is to work with our larger customers who are going through security assurance compliance transformation. Kane?
Thanks, Aidan. I'm Kane McGladrey, Field CISO at Hyperproof. I've got nearly 30 years of experience in the space, and I'm a GRC thought leader specializing in really communicating how changes to our ever-evolving GRC space really impact businesses of all sizes. But that's us. Let's talk about the audience. So the reason you're here today is you're probably wondering about the future of governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, and you probably want to know the results of our survey data, as well as how you can leverage that to make more strategic decisions. So we're going to explore this year's insights, and this is our fifth annual survey results, to really talk about how you can reach your 2024 goals. So today we're going to cover three main topics: why using integrated GRC platforms led to better outcomes, how companies are tackling risk in 2024, and then what the outcome for the rest of this year really does look like. But first, let's talk about who we surveyed. Aidan?
Thanks, Kane. And as you said, this is our fifth year doing this survey. We conduct it really to make sure we have a crisp understanding of what's happening with this domain, but also gives us the opportunity to share back with folks like you information that we think will be useful as you're having internal conversations around the work that you're doing. So fifth year, we survey about 1,000 practitioners, GRC and IT professionals. And in this past year, back in November, we had about 70% of the respondents from the US and then about 30 from the UK. One of the common themes beyond the domain areas we'll talk about is these respondents continue to express some concerns about economic uncertainty, recessionary fears, and how that will impact the work that they're being asked to do. So we survey companies in multiple industries. You'll see there's a bias towards technology, but we try to cut across as many industries as we can. You'll see banking and fintech and others represented there as well. We survey companies ranging in size. The majority are in that kind of high-end mid-market, $100 to $500 million revenue range, but we have customers or other respondents at both ends of that, smaller organizations and larger enterprises as well. In terms of who we survey and who the respondents are, one of the questions we're always interested in is their decision-making capability. Where are they in the organization? The majority of those surveyed were the sole decision maker when it came to cybersecurity or risk management, compliance kinds of decisions for the organization. 45% of the respondents were in IT, and then really excited to see an uptick this year in the number of C-suite practice professionals that are responding to the survey, so we get more of a nuanced view on what their thoughts are as well. Kane?
Thanks, Aidan. So more commonly, companies that we surveyed had between 1,000 and 2,500 employees, and they'd been in business for about 5 to 10 years. And primarily, their job functions were in IT and then information security, though sometimes those do tend to blend together. followed by IT audit or IT compliance. Aidan, what was the first major theme that our data really uncovered?
Thanks, Kane. And this is a really interesting one. And we'll talk more about what we mean by outcomes when we get into this. But the first theme that came across from our respondents is that those organizations and the respondents from those organizations that had moved to a more integrated view of looking at risk and compliance, as opposed to keeping them very segregated, they got better outcomes. And I think intuitively we have a sense that we'll get better results, we'll have better insights the more integrated we are. But to see actual tangible outcomes that are improved, that's exciting for us, and we'll share more about that as we go through. The first and one of the most important findings, truly, was that as organizations reported back on how they're managing risk management and compliance operations, those that are managing them in an integrated way, a significant increase year on year. Last year, we had a number less than this. 55% of our respondents this time said that they're managing them in an integrated way, up about 20% from last year. And the thinking here, I think our interpretation would be that when organizations and teams are working off the same data, the same processes, the same workflows, they have better collaboration. They're sharing insights more broadly. It also maybe becomes a reason for them to do that as they see better results. So we were excited to see this focus on more integration, more of a holistic view, bringing together risk and compliance in a way to drive better outcomes.
I think also something to bear in mind here is this is what a board is commonly starting to expect at this point. Like board members and sometimes even senior management, your C-level executives, are starting to expect that of their teams, that they get a holistic view, that they don't need three separate reports because honestly they don't have time and it's hard for them to parse. And so this move towards integration is definitely it's a trend we're seeing just across all industries in business.
That's exactly right, Ken. And a reflection of that as well is a kind of similar question around how organizations are managing IT risks. And last year we had about 31%, I think, of our respondents that said they were managing really in a siloed way. They had very distinct and disparate processes for managing IT risks. Versus this year, that number went down significantly. About 19% of our respondents said that they were managing IT risks in a siloed way. And obviously the opposite of that then is that the vast majority now are building that more holistic view for some of the reasons that Kane talked about, for reasons related to a single view, for reasons related to the ability to share insights. Teams are looking for more unified solutions. Management teams are demanding the same. And they're also, I think, better understanding how these data silos that they've operated in the past impact their ability to have good insights and support the business in the right way.
And I also love that our data really do support that there are better outcomes, which I know Aidan is going to be speaking about next.
Yeah. And so in terms of outcomes, one of the ones that is pretty obvious and one that gets increasingly management's attention is around how secure are we? And a measure of that is how prone we are to breaches. And obviously there's been a lot of press coverage around breaches, and every board member, every senior executive knows to think about that now. And so we were excited to dive a little bit into looking at how, when organizations had a more integrated risk and compliance approach, did that affect outcomes related to breaches? And the data, as Kane said, strongly support that. 46% of our respondents who had an approach around risk and compliance that was more tightly integrated had experienced a breach in the past year, whereas 70% of those that had experienced a breach did not have that more integrated approach. And so our takeaway is a pretty significant differential between that integrated approach to risk and compliance and one that we feel also enables organizations internally now to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I'd say as well, just as a CISO, this intuitively makes sense, but admittedly, it's also justifying some of my preconceived notions and biases. Having been in cybersecurity for nearly 30 years. But the idea is if you have a unified view towards everything that is a potential business risk, whether it's the risk of a breach, or whether it's a compliance risk, or whether it's another existential business risk that would be covered in your ERM. Having all of those in one space really allows businesses to more appropriately allocate their resources, and also for the security staff, especially who would be working to prevent a breach, makes them understand what the company's priorities are so they can make strategic resource allocation decisions, as opposed to prior decades where we've seen it done in a vacuum. Now, I also have to point out at this point, this is correlation, this is not causation. This is not to say that if you have a disparate view of risk, you are going to have a bad day. Just we're seeing it's more likely that that's going to happen.
And Ken, just to pick up on that and to dive a little more deeply into the data, here's another review of that point. So if we look at how do organizations approach risk management, and whether that's it's ad hoc, or they respond when something goes wrong, whether they've outsourced it to somebody like an MSSP, or they're using a much more integrated, oftentimes more automated approach, how does that affect those outcomes? And so we asked the question around breaches over the last 24 months. And you'll see here that in terms of organizations that did suffer breaches, the lowest number of those was organizations that had an integrated tool with significant automation. And so what that tells us is that as organizations mature and bring both process, collaboration, bring technology and tools that enable automation, as they think about risk and compliance in a more unified way, that does yield definitely better outcomes. So Ken, the question obviously then was, and you touched upon it, I think, a little bit, but what's your sense of why do we get that? Why do we get those better outcomes?
Yeah, I think what we really found in our data is that these integrated organizations are more likely to be attentive to the controls they've put in place to ensure that their security objectives are being met. And organizations in that integrated cohort, they're better at identifying controls for risk mitigation, at identifying and assessing their risks, at flagging their control deficiencies, at assessing those control effectiveness and aligning their controls with risks, and then remediating issues than organizations in the other two cohorts. And really it comes down to is a more proactive stance towards being an active participant in all of these processes, as opposed to having to make it up as you go along or having to fumble through. Those who integrate there and align their risk and compliance tend to be better at managing their workload and their tasks associated with it. And the reason that they're spending their time actually looking at their controls, doing control observation and testing the effectiveness of those controls, that's probably due to trying to get external attestations or certifications, so that could help them win business, or perhaps they need to complete an audit, or they have an audit finding that they have to reduce. And so that's why we're seeing that correlation there in that integrated cohort. Aidan, you talked a little bit about automated evidence collection just in the prior slide. What did we see around that space?
Yeah, and we want to call this one out because for a number of reasons, right? When we think about a closer collaboration, integration between risk and compliance, one of the common underpinnings for that is controls and how we manage controls, how we operationalize controls. One of the key elements of managing controls is being able to have some opinion on how effective they are. And we do that typically by gathering evidence. And evidence collection is a huge burden. And as we have more and more complex tech environments, it's becoming even more burdensome, not only on teams who are focused around risk and compliance, but even more so on folks across the organization who have to be responsive to audits. So let's talk a little bit about how evidence collection, how that burden has changed year on year. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that more and more respondents than ever are using some GRC software, some tools for purposes like evidence collection. Year on year, the number of those who are now using tools to collect evidence automatically, as opposed to pinging somebody for a screenshot, is up about 10%, which is similar to what we saw last year. So we're seeing an ongoing maturity of these burdensome tasks. And the theme that we would pick out of this is that increasingly organizations, stakeholders across the organization will come to expect that using automations to gather evidence to reduce the burden on the rest of the organization is becoming part of standard operating procedure. So we should expect to see more of that.
And I think especially when we think of the current macroeconomic climate and some of the tone at the top right now, I think we're going to see drives towards efficiency that only can be achieved really through automation. You can't necessarily hire your way out of an auditing burden or just an evidence collection burden.
Exactly. And if we dive a little bit deeper into that, we wanted to see if the evidence collection habits, so how organizations do that, does that lead to differing results between the approaches that organizations take? And we found that those organizations, compared to the other two groups, are much more diligent in collecting evidence, and that evidence that they use to verify controls, to ensure they're operating effectively, to test those controls over and beyond what we do typically as part of an audit. And in fact, they're more likely to have that continuous evidence management process put in place, which in turn enables more of a continuous compliance, continuous control testing approach, which is obviously much harder if you're focusing just on gathering that evidence when you need it. And again, we would argue that it's becoming more of a required practice now, that we are moving to that idea of continuous collection of evidence, continuous testing of that, and then more of a continuous view of our compliance and risk posture. So let's talk a little bit then more about how respondents are using technology to streamline manual processes. Almost 70% of our respondents are using a GRC software tool for automation purposes. Those things include evidence collection that we talked about, but also issue tracking, remediation, monitoring, testing controls, risk and compliance reporting. That's up about 15% from last year. And that, again, should not be a huge surprise given the amount of activity that's in that market. Kane, you talk to CISOs all the time. What do you see about tools usage in the survey data?
You know, we asked respondents actually to identify which tools they were using to manage their IT compliance efforts. And the largest portion of the respondents use a cloud-based GRC tool. That's just over 40%. While purpose-built software for IT compliance, which was the second most commonly used tool, saw an increase year over year to 31% in 2024. And on-premises GRC software, that really reduced year over year, and that really demonstrates the steady march to the cloud. But the usage of spreadsheets, Word documents, and file storage systems, that saw a slight increase from 10% to 14%, and custom-built software usage decreased from 7% to 4% year over year. So one explanation, because I remember getting really excited about the death of spreadsheets last year when we presented our fourth annual survey. Well, this year we saw that increase in spreadsheet usage. And over the last year, I think a lot of GRC teams suffered budget cuts, and they were forced to revert back to doing things manually and to using non-purpose-built, less ideal tools. And they're still looking to get that consolidated view of risk and compliance, probably being asked of it as well by their board members and their senior management. And that's essential to them being able to safeguard their businesses while still remaining agile and lean. And let's talk about those manual processes just for a minute here, because I mentioned that. And risk management teams still deal with this stuff all the time, where it's a manual process and it's time consuming. And we asked, well, which tasks are you struggling with? And they were able to select as many options from this list as they wanted. But identifying critical risks for prioritization of remediations, that's still the number one challenge year over year. The most notable change this year was a 20% increase in switching between multiple systems for risk management. And that was the second most painful task that our respondents struggled with, which signals that they're still, and this is especially true in the enterprise space, they're still working through that complex landscape of multiple technology tools. In cybersecurity, we call this the chair pivot problem, where you sometimes literally have to pivot between different chairs to get more information. There's also a strong progressive industry inclination here towards centralizing the risk and compliance management data and solutions. And the fact that we're still talking about chair pivots, the fact that we're still having this struggle of manual operations and having to switch between multiple tools really does underscore the need for a more consolidated and a more integrated approach. Aidan, let's move on to our next big topic that we found in the data.
Thanks, Kane. And as we said at the beginning, The second theme that we typically inquire about on the survey relates to risk and how are companies thinking about risk. And as you might imagine, what we've seen as we ask this set of questions each year is what comes back to us is really a reflection of what organizations are reading about, what they're hearing about, what's top of mind, oftentimes what's in the news, but also it's a reflection of where they're spending their time. And as you might expect, there's a focus on emerging risks, and I don't think any presentation like this would be complete without some reference to AI. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Other topics that drive risk thinking, we touched upon it earlier, is breaches. So what's happening to us and how does that relate to our view on risk? And then the last thing that's become a significantly bigger challenge and interest for the respondents is around third-party risk, supply chain. How do they think about that?
Yeah, something I can't help but notice is I wonder how our audience is feeling like, wait, they went 20 minutes without mentioning AI. Is this a presentation in 2024 where they're not talking about it? And yeah, we do have some data on it, but we decided to wait because I think every other presentation folks have been to this year was probably AI in the top 3 slides.
That's absolutely right. And while it's clearly top of mind for the respondents, I do think that people and folks who are in this domain have a more nuanced view of it. And we get excited about the potential of AI, but we also understand some of the risks associated with it better perhaps than other parts of the organization. And so again, the numbers here shouldn't be too much of a surprise. 61% of our respondents expected to be able to leverage AI to streamline the work that they're doing as it relates to risk and control and compliance. And ideas such as being able to look at frameworks and decide and recommend what are suitable controls, looking across our controls landscape and looking for duplicates. Things like that feel like a reasonably good use of AI in this domain. And so we're not surprised to see, almost 2/3 of our respondents reflect that. And then the other big area is that we have so much documentation in this domain. We have so much around policies and procedures and frameworks and standards that being able to use AI to extract semantic meaning from that documentation, be able to ensure that we're staying up to date with it, we understand what it actually means, what new regulations mean to us. Absolutely, we would expect to see, again, almost 2/3 of our respondents wanting to use the tools to be able to review documentation. If we step back from that just a little bit, 80% of our respondents said that AI was important to their team's operations going forward. Important or very important. So again, we would expect to see the teams that are focused around risk and compliance really want to understand how they can get efficiency and get insight from the use of AI. However, and this again, we would expect from the respondents that we target, they are concerned about the business risks that are associated with generative AI, and for good reason. I think our respondents typically have a good understanding of the boundaries of the organization, what data is important inside the organization, and how that might be inadvertently shared. And so there's some concern there. But broadly, about 39% of the respondents expressed concern about the business risks related to generative AI, with 22% being extremely concerned, a mere 2% not concerned. I'd like at some point to understand that a little bit better, candidly. But clearly, this is something that we will want to balance the risks associated with it and the undoubted value that we can get from it. Kim, what do you think?
So first of all, I think that 2% is possibly the AI zealots that are just going to YOLO it, right? They're going to put themselves at the forefront and try to make everything better and not worry about the consequences. I believe that's Silicon Valley: move fast, break stuff, and we'll see how that turns out for everybody. But where I get more interested is how respondents were actually managing AI risk, because we've started to see some legislation and some regulatory change in this, and it's very slow coming. And a lot of the CISOs I've talked to have said, so is this like a CISO thing or is this a compliance thing? And like, how do we actually manage our risk? And so when we surveyed folks, we found that they're most commonly conducting regular audits to ensure compliance with their own generative AI related policies and controls. And that was closely followed by modifying controls in an existing framework that their company was already using, as opposed to picking something new. And the reason why is that companies had to really adapt quickly to new AI risks. And rather than starting from scratch, the majority of the respondents worked with stuff that they had at hand, which were those existing controls in their existing frameworks. And also, I talked about there's not a lot of regulation. Like there's the HIT-1 rule in the United States, and goodness knows the EU is working on some legislation in this space. But right now, this is predominantly self-regulation of AI risk because all of that is under development. So when we ask them about, well, which control frameworks are you using? Unsurprisingly, NIST CSF, the NIST cybersecurity framework, is the most commonly used framework to manage the AI risk, and that's at 23%. It's also the most commonly used framework across all of our survey respondents across multiple vertices. And one explanation for its popularity is that it can be really applied to a wide variety of use cases and industries. Now, NIST's AI risk management framework, this was a surprise. It became the second most commonly used framework to manage AI risk, and that came in at 16%. And I say that's surprising because it's a new framework. It came out in January of 2023, and that was developed with a partnership between public and private sectors to really better manage the risks to individuals, organizations, and then society associated with the use of artificial intelligence. And so now that we've talked about AI risks and frameworks, I want to get a little deeper on risk management. Last year's report found that only 42% of respondents reported experiencing a breach in the last 24 months. Well, our latest survey paints I'd say it's more concerning picture, revealing a notable spike to 59%, which is a relative 40% increase from the previous year, which really underscores that need for a proactive and integrated view and approach towards cybersecurity and GRC. And if you're curious, if you want to know about how those data breaches might impact your insurance premiums, check out our webinar last year with my friend Shay. And it's called To Buy or Not Buy, When Is Cyber Insurance Worth It?, which you can find on our website at hyperproof.io. But there is some good news. The number of companies reporting that they've pivoted from having a siloed approach to managing their IT risks across departments, processes, and tech to a more unified approach, that's dramatically improved. It's actually a 78% relative reduction year over year. And the vast majority of the surveyed organizations have made commitments to manage their IT risks using a formal, disciplined approach. Now, the most common action was leveraging a risk management standard or a framework at 94% of respondents. Another leading action was leveraging automated tools like integrated GRC platforms to facilitate operating their programs. And using those platforms makes monitoring and maintaining internal controls a significantly easier task as opposed to the manual work that typically takes place when you have to assess your control effectiveness. And that emphasis on eliminating tedious and manual processes, along with the conclusions of our past 5 reports, really demonstrate a shift in the market to adopt such technologies to really make sure we have a more streamlined risk and compliance experience for our teams. We also found that companies with an integrated approach to compliance and risk management, and in most cases, they've really formalized their approach to risk management more than those who did not. So respondents with an integrated approach more frequently used automated tools for continuous risk monitoring and control testing. They were also more likely to map the controls to the risks that they're mitigating, as well as having a dedicated risk committee that meets regularly to update and maintain their risk register. Of course, those with an integrated approach were also more likely to have the technology infrastructure and architecture to really support that integrated risk management. And you compare that with the respondents who handle risk and compliance separately. Those who had an integrated approach were 13% more likely to conduct risk assessments, and these were risk assessments in addition to their scheduled risk assessments, whenever there was a major change that could change their risk profile and reprioritize their risks. So taking an integrated approach to risk management and compliance really does help accomplish a more formalized risk management commitment. Aidan, I have only talked about first-party risk. Can you talk to us a little bit about third-party risk management?
Absolutely. And before I go there, I want to make just one comment on what you said, Kane. something that stands out and something we've seen changing over the last couple of years is really a focus on using some external standard, a risk management framework or a standard to be able to conduct the activities within the organization. I think back to some of my risk consulting days. We didn't always do that. We oftentimes took a blank sheet of paper approach and try to do what we thought was best inside the organization. There's a greater desire for comparability. There's a greater desire to be able to showcase that we are doing something that is broadly accepted across organizations and across the industry. And that's one of the ways that's reflected is in the use of these risk management frameworks or standards to bring kind of a common language across that work.
I think also, Aidan, that's related to jurisprudence we've seen in this space. And yes, I just dropped a $5 word, but when companies go to court, I think that those that say we're using the NIST AI risk management framework or the NIST framework or the ISO 30001, please don't DM me to tell me I got the number wrong, risk management framework, are going to have a better time in court or with their insurance company than if they said, well, Aidan told us was a good idea, right? So I think that's the other desire there to use proven solutions and to adapt them for your own organization rather than just making it up as you go.
Absolutely, even though my ideas are truly amazing. Our third main theme that came out of the risk section then is around third party and even nth party risk. And again, should not come as a surprise to us. I think what we're seeing is that there's an increasing understanding within an organization that we don't control all of our own destiny, and a desire for us to understand exactly where we have risks that are outside of our boundaries and how do we manage those. And so let's talk a little bit more deeply around how organizations are thinking about third party and nth party risk. It emerged originally as a priority in our survey back in 2023. And so we saw it becoming more of a priority then. It continues to be a topic of interest for companies and for regulators. One common theme that we found throughout the data was that and Ken touched upon this, with fears of a recession, economic uncertainty, budget consolidations, increased calls for efficiency, respondents were less happy about using a disparate point solution. They wanted a platform that includes vendor risk management, but understands that third and nth party risks are another set of risks for the organization. And how we respond to those, how we mitigate those, has to be consistent with our overall approach to managing all of the risks that we're managing within the organization. And how does it tie back to all the other GRC work that we're doing? Integrating that and having a view of risk that's more integrated provides more resources for the various teams. They have the power to see data flowing between systems and to leverage that. So what that meant in the data was that almost 75% of our respondents are using a platform to manage vendor risks, integrated into their compliance operations. And then about a quarter of the respondents are using that module from a broader GRC solution. And I think that makes sense to us because as we've looked at increasing sophistication around vendor risk, some of the tools that specifically focus on that, the dedicated solutions, just by definition, it seems, have a broader and a richer set of functionality. The significance, though, is that efficient compliance operations is now a differentiator. Being able to do this well is important. And so not only from a revenue standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint, from a trust standpoint, the importance of this tooling, the importance of this technology, these approaches, increase the organization's ability to show that they're adhering to various standards, and as Kane alluded to, have an ability to defend themselves should something go wrong.
Yeah, and I do think that last point is important. Those of you who follow me on LinkedIn know that I've made a goal of trying to read almost all of the 10K Section 1C disclosures that all the companies are making right now. And I've read several hundred, let's call it 600-ish or so of them. And I'd say in almost 100% of them, they talk about either third-party risk management or vendor risk management. And what this means is the publicly traded companies, whether they're a small publicly traded penny stock or whether they're a multi-billion-dollar company, they're all going to be asking their suppliers, their vendors, everyone in their supply chain about their third-party risk management. And they're also looking for ways to integrate that intelligence that they're getting into their own risk profile, because the external regulator, in this case the Security and Exchange Commission, is asking them to report on that and may ask them to attest if they have an nth party breach, as Aidan alluded to, or a third party breach. How did they miss it, or what omissions or what did they do to try and control it? And I'm seeing those in those regulatory filings as well around third party risk.
And just to pick up on that, Ken, the data strongly support that. We asked our respondents if they'd experienced an audit finding, and that encompasses either an external audit, internal audit, or regulatory review, findings that were related to a third party. And so have they experienced something where it's been reported up through a formal finding? Almost all, close to 80%, said that they had. Again, this reflects, I think, as Kane said, a stronger focus on those external parties that are assessing us, looking at our full supply chain, whether that be a software supply chain or other supply chains that impact the business, and asking more questions about how much we understand of those third and nth parties. Do we understand their impact on us? Understand how they might have significant negative impacts on our business? And not understanding those is a cause for an audit finding. And then the other thing that, again, shouldn't come as a surprise to us, we saw about 90% of the respondents are expecting an audit finding this year. So you see that clearly on the chart. It's almost everybody that they're expecting to have some external party call them on the work they're doing around third-party risk. And then we asked backwards and we said, have your organization experienced any of these? 62% of the respondents had a supply chain disruption, and we clearly read a lot about that in the press. Those are specifically related to cybersecurity, and that affected their ability to deliver on their business, whether it's goods or services. Last year, that was a little lower, it was about 54%, so about 8 percentage points or so of an increase year on year. 56% of the respondents experienced a data privacy breach due to a third party. That was up almost 25% year on year. So that's an area where organizations are becoming more concerned, and it also opens up a whole range of causes for action. When you've got data privacy breaches, it impacts contracts, impacts customer relationships. So there's a big risk around that. And then the number of compliance violations related to the third-party oversight. So what are we doing to manage these parties that we're in business with? Interestingly enough, we reduced by about 42% year on year. So last year, we actually had a higher number where we saw a compliance violation related to third-party oversight. It's down to about 28% of the respondents this year, lower than the previous years. So that speaks to the attention that we're bringing to it. Having said that, that decrease is a little bit surprising, given that everything else in the third-party landscape has grown in frequency. So we'll continue to kind of monitor that a bit more closely. Maybe it says we're doing a good job, but we are also, as you see in the other bars here, getting more activity, getting more negative results. Most of the third-party incidents experienced were either related to data or privacy breaches or supply chain disruptions. But with so many, almost all of the respondents expecting an audit finding this coming year, we'll see other violations grow as well. So it'll be interesting to come back next year and see what we've learned and what our respondents have experienced. Then let's kind of bring this to a focus around then looking forward. Everything has been today really looking back and thinking and asking our respondents what have they done and experienced. So now looking forward, we'll talk about what that means for organizations. We'll talk a little bit about what our respondents are saying about their time commitments, their budgets, headcounts, how they'll make decisions. Okay, let's start with budgets. What do we hear there?
So I'd say really the volatile macroeconomic climate and pushes for more efficiency in the GRC space really changed the landscape of budgeting across departments. Having said that, 69% of respondents expected to spend more money on IT risk management in 2024. Remember, we surveyed folks in 2023 in November. So this might not actually be the reality. CFOs and boards are pushing IT and risk teams to consolidate their tech stacks. They're asking for a series of streamlined and integrated places to look for insights so that they can communicate their risk and compliance posture to their stakeholders and showcase how their work is related to unlocking higher level company objectives. And on average, respondents estimated that they were going to increase their budgets by 29% this year. Well, in our survey data last year, folks thought their budgets were going to go up by 25%. Now, a majority of our respondents thought that their budgets were going to go between 11 to 25%. But remember, we surveyed this in November of last year, and the economic climate really has changed since then. And the market at the time probably impacted respondents' thinking around budgets, as well as how much work they had coming, and consequently, how much they were anticipating their budget would go up. So, what's really driving that anticipated increase in spending? Well, it comes down to increased regulatory changes and stricter enforcement. That's really front and center for IT risk and compliance professionals because as governments and different regulatory bodies continue to be active in defining new rules and regulations, companies are really wary of being able to keep up. And that's compounded by the fact that most companies, they're seeing their tech stack expand year over year. It's predominantly in the cloud, which also expands their risk footprint. So companies are looking for solutions that can help them keep up with all these external regulatory changes while also enabling them to better monitor and manage their risks across their organization, especially as that third party and nth party risk footprint expands on an annual basis. So then where does the money go? Where are the budgets all going? Well, risk management is the bulk of budgets, and audits are actually consuming the least. 28% of organizations are allocating funds towards risk management this year, further emphasizing that growing importance of managing risk and the need for transparency across organizations to communicate their risks to stakeholders. And this really does line and cover with what we're seeing in the broader market narrative, where companies in their 1C filings, again, in those 10Ks to the Security and Exchange Commission, they're talking about cybersecurity risk management, but they're also already required under Sarbanes-Oxley to talk about the rest of their risk management around their financial risks. So companies are looking to present a unified view to their investors to actually create and instill confidence in the market about their capability to manage all of these risks. And that's despite the fact that this is the first year that companies are actually being asked to talk publicly, on the record, if you will, about how they are managing their risks effectively. Aiden, let's move to our next topic. I've talked about budget. How about time management? What did we hear in that space?
Yeah, that's maybe the other piece of this, right? Is where our organization is spending their time, and I doubt this will be too much of a surprise either. The nuance here is that we ask the question around, as an organization, do you expect the organization to spend more or less time on IT risk management in this coming year? And you'll see, what is it, something like 60% are spending about the same or more on IT risk management. Last year, I think we asked the question, and it was a little bit lower in terms of the expectation of spending more time. We expect that to continue. And again, with all the drivers that Kane's talked about, with especially for larger and public companies, a focus on greater accountability and reporting and disclosures, we would expect to see that. But then with a myriad of new privacy regulations, with a myriad of new geographic-based standards, market entry requirements, we would expect to see organizations spending more time. And it's been interesting to watch this over the years, the balance between time and technology. So the idea that we spend more time on it, but as we spend more time, we realize that the need for more technology support, and then that drives some of those technology decisions as well. A part of the justification oftentimes for the work that we do is how do we avoid negative consequences? And so one of our questions is asking our respondents, what's been the impact of their data breaches? And it's a large financial impact. And we try to capture all the costs associated with that breach. Almost 60% of our surveyed respondents had experienced a data breach in the last 2 years. And of that 60%, about 43% reported losing between $1 million to less than $5 million, significant cost. That's up about 10% for that block. That's up about 10% year on year. And then notably for the last 3 years, respondents continue to report that tranche, that 1 million to 5 million. That's the one that's reported more than any other amount. And that's been pretty consistent over the last 3 years. So then coming back to how organizations are dealing with this, we've asked our questions around who's involved in decision making, who are you engaging with, and that's interesting because it speaks to the theme of more integration, but also speaks to the theme of a greater understanding of the importance of IT risk and control to broader business objectives. So the highlight here is that decision making is becoming more collaborative. And specifically with companies that have a more integrated IT risk and compliance practice, that decision making involves more stakeholders. 47% of our respondents said that the folks in IT and GRC are with those related titles. They're the champion in moving this forward. Again, we'd expect to see that, maybe even a little bit higher. Almost half of the respondents said that their CFO is on the financial approval and the final financial approval oftentimes for these decisions. And that's interesting because we will need to make sure that as a domain and practitioners who work in this area, that we're crisp around what the business value is of the work that we do here. Because a CFO is balancing resource allocation across the organization, ensuring they understand the value of what we're delivering is really, really important. Now, as more stakeholders get involved in that buying process, it's important that we all understand what those mean. So moving from that to looking at how organizations think about the, how their process impacts their decision-making strategies. Those in the cohort that manage risk ad hoc or manage risk when something goes wrong are more likely to be the sole decision makers. And that might be a reflection of size of organization as well, but they tend to be the ones that are more focused on being more reactive. And likely that's a resource issue, it's a size issue as well. And the other end of the extreme then is as they have a more integrated view, there's more collaboration. There's more folks involved around evaluating the decisions on the use of tools and technology and responses. Now, Kane, you run our CISO roundtable amongst other things. What do you hear from CISOs on this?
You know, I as Aidan mentions, I run a private CISO roundtable for about 100 friends. And what they're reporting really is a drive towards collaboration. And part of that is wanting to spread personal risk, but also part of it is getting business buy-in. It's not it's no longer considered to be okay for a CISO to drop a new tool and say, here, everybody, here's a new tool, off you go, have fun. Because that, like, if you don't have broad-based support, it's really not going to go well for you. And I think that top-down management approach is starting to fail. I think that it's more important that CISOs really work with their business partners, and I'm hearing this from the CISOs that I work with, who understand they can help advise companies, their business units on risk, but they can't necessarily say all of the facts on risk. They can contribute to the conversation, they can provide tooling, they can make recommendations, but also when it comes down to deciding, like, how are we going to treat our risks, how are we going to report our risks, that also is where CISOs, and a lot of this does come down to the Tim Brown thing. Sorry, for those of you who don't follow shorthand, that's the SEC versus SolarWinds civil suit, where they're trying to limit their own personal civil liability associated with just doing their jobs. And consequently, they're trying to spread that throughout the organization so that their business partners really are partners in those conversations around business risks.
And a nice follow on from that, Kane, is who in the organization is overseeing compliance. Compared to a year ago, the executive lead around compliance is now more likely to report to a C-level executive versus a lower level position in the organization than before. Last year, I think we had about 53% of our respondents reported having C-level executives as the highest level position overseeing compliance. That's numbers got up to 63% this year, so a full 10-point increase. And Kane touched upon a couple of the external drivers, some of the new SEC requirements, for instance, that definitely impact public companies' perception of the importance of these activities. Kane, you mentioned SEC before. Anything else that you think is driving this?
We conducted the survey in November. The SEC guidelines or requirements became final in October, and I don't know everybody had been expecting that. I think I've read a couple filings where in October or November they made the audit committee actually own cybersecurity, and so I think that number of companies where the highest level function is a C-level executive, it's only going to go up. I don't think that's going to materially go down after this. I think we're recognizing that cybersecurity ultimately compliance is a business problem.
Yeah. And that's also then reflected in staff sizes. And so we asked the question around what's the size of the organization group within the business that's focused on InfoSec and compliance. And year on year, we've typically seen staff sizes growing. About 83% of the organizations that we surveyed have 5 or more FTEs dedicated to compliance. And that's about 10 points up from last year. So last year we had about 70% of organizations that had 5 or more people. And that's reflective, I think, of what Ken just talked about, especially for larger organizations, and understanding and a better understanding of the importance of this function to a range of different business outcomes, both positive and negative. And so we continue to expect to see some growth in staff sizes, but balancing that with macroeconomic uncertainty, with budget pressure. There'll also be, I think, a concurrent view around an approach around how do we get the most out of these resources that are working in these functions. We asked the question then around specifically in your organization. Do you expect to increase, decrease, or stay the same in terms of the team size? Last year, about 70% of the respondents said that they expected their team size to increase. So that's a significant majority. This year is even more pronounced. It's more like 77, almost 80% of our respondents expect to increase their team size. But as we said earlier, some of the macroeconomic situations and outlooks may impact that. And in fact, they would argue that we're not broadly adding resources. We tend to be cutting them. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there that we'll want to dive into some more as we continue to work on the survey and talk to our respondents. Professionals in this space, though, are receiving a lot of pressure from decision makers, CFOs, and others to be able to deliver more without adding a whole lot of resources. And there's not yet a really good balance between the increasing expectations and requirements, regulatory requirements, reporting requirements, and then the work that comes with that as it relates to the need for increased headcount, the need for more efficiency. So we will just continue to expect more pressure on getting more done with less. Pardon me. One interesting thing, though, we noticed was that those organizations that are managing risk ad hoc are more likely to grow their teams. And that does make the argument again that a more integrated approach using technology, using automations is more likely to reduce the need for adding a lot of headcount. Makes some intuitive sense that we would want to add more headcount without those automations. Pardon me. Finally, let's wrap it up. Ken, bring us home.
Fantastic. Thanks, Aidan. So really, the conventional approach of relying on disparate point solutions That's just not efficient for GRC professionals, because demand has really shifted towards finding a comprehensive integrated tech solution that really does cater to the diverse needs of all of our stakeholders. Your internal audit team, your risk management, your IT, and your compliance teams, they all need to have data. They all have data that they want to contribute, and we need to move away from silos. Something else that I spoke to is that CISOs at companies that file a 10K with that new Section 1C, they're worried that what's in their 1C or what's not in Section 1C could be brought up in an enforcement action if they have a material breach this year or some future year. And if the SEC decides that they're going to get into like really hard on enforcement. And GRC platforms really are helping to make those 2025 SEC disclosures less scary by automating many of the processes, especially around evidence collection. And that evidence collection also verifies your operating controls in case, again, the SEC leans into enforcement. And that's going to help drive business efficiencies for organizations that have got downward staffing and budgetary pressures. But I also think it's, I was reading a 10K just yesterday. They made up a framework name for a program that just does not exist. Like, I cannot help but think if they'd had an integrated program, like a dashboard that said, here are cybersecurity programs, just copy paste them into the SEC disclosure, they would have not had the time of making up an entire one. And I can't help but wonder, like, how's that going to go for you in court, y'all? Like, you can have a bad time for having made up your own terms or not. And that's the kind of mistake that you can create if you don't have that integrated view, if you've got that disparate view. And that's the final thing here, is that GRC professionals are really working to reduce those data silos between risk management and compliance operations so that they can get that clearer view of their actual true compliance postures. We do recommend tying controls to your risks so you can streamline your efficiencies, but that also makes GRC a strategic differentiator rather than just a cost center. So with that, I want to thank you. We both want to thank you for joining us today. If you're attending right now, you'll receive a copy of the 2024 IT Risk and Compliance Benchmark Report in your inbox shortly. We had a lot to cover today, and we didn't have the time to get into the questions. So if you dropped a question in the chat, we will respond to those by email as soon as possible. You can also reach out to us anytime at info@hyperproof.io. And if you want to learn more about Hyperproof, check out our website, again, hyperproof.io, or reach out to us directly. With that, thank you everyone for spending an hour of your day with us. Have a great day.